Ever since our kit details have dropped, people have been constantly comparing Xilonen to the current meta staple Kazuha due to the extremely similar nature of their kits. So ultimately, who is better? Hello there, Flip here, and today we're here to answer that question, giving an in-depth breakdown into how these characters compare to each other in terms of their buffing, accessibility, flexibility, as well as their vertical investment endeavors. And as always, if at any point during the video you're entertained or informed, make sure to drop a like and even consider subscribing, as I talk on various topics regarding Genshin's meta and I'll try to keep you updated. And with that, let's begin. I don't want to do the announcer voice again because that unironically hurt my throat the last time. Pause. But in the ring we first have the Ocelot, and since she's a new character, I'm going to be very briefly going over her kit. As with all Natlan characters, her skill will activate her Night Soul Blessing state, in which she gets her cardio in, but the most important part is that she'll have 3 samples that will correspond to the matching element of your teammates, unless they are Onoma or Dendro, because fuck those guys. And when you normal attack twice with her, assuming you have at least 2 swirlable elements on your team, her samples will get activated and reduce nearby enemies' resistances corresponding to the matching elements in your team. And then for what is relevant, her burst will give you a strong single target heal for the next 12 seconds. To finalize things, she gets access to the scroll set being a Natlan character, so she can give a 40% damage bonus to your team. Overall, a very solid support. Her opponent for today is going to be the staple Onoma buffer Kazuha, who also gets to hold a broken artifact set in the forms of iridescent, additionally giving a damage bonus based on his elemental mastery, as well as enabling a strong form of grouping through his elemental skill, and being able to enable reactions through his elemental burst. And with our fighters introduced, let's decide who's better. Since they're both supports meant to amplify damage, I think it's important that we first discuss just how potent their buffing is. Xilonen at talent level 10 gives a 36% resistance shred to an element, whereas Kazuha will give a 40% rest shred. Then damage bonus wise, since Kazuha's buffing is based on his elemental mastery, his damage bonus will fluctuate depending on the amount of EM you have. If you have a weapon like Xiphos which gives you EM while helping to meet his energy requirements, then assuming 960 EM, you get a 38% damage bonus. Whereas if you have a weapon like Favonius, it ends up being like 800 EM for a 32% damage bonus. Xilonen, due to the scroll set, will generally be a consistent 40% damage bonus, so using this basis on a few different damage dealers and then averaging them, the buffing they do is so close at C0 that it's negligible. What does matter is how these buffs are applied and the uptime of them. For Kazuha, Iridescent lasts for 10 seconds and cannot be refreshed all field, and his damage bonus lasts for 8 seconds but can be refreshed all field due to his burst. So if you constantly trigger this, it's effectively 16 seconds. But this is assuming you always swirl the right element, which isn't guaranteed. Kazuha's buff uptime can actually be somewhat awkward on teams due to this. For Vape teams, his damage buff will only last 8 seconds, as you can't use the burst to extend his A4, as you won't reswirl Pyro, which is the same case and vice versa for Mualani. Some VV Vape rotations don't even bother using his burst at all, as it doesn't enable anything for them. This is also where double swirling comes into effect, as since the buff uptime is so low, you want to swirl both your elements at the same time in order for them to not fall off in your rotations, and these can be somewhat inconsistent, especially in AoE, where people just don't want to learn them. Speaking of which, Iridescent is only applied on the enemies affected, so when a new wave of enemies spawn in, the resistant shred isn't going to carry over to the new enemies. And if you're using a carry that can't be swapped out, which is a lot of them, then you're just bleeding damage in these cases. And there are also just some teams you can't play him on at all, really, like double melt teams, as once you establish a Pyro aura, you can't establish a cryo one with the Pyro applicators we have, unless you swirl cryo early in your rotations, in which case the buff will just run out. And then there are also enemies with innate auras that Kazuha can't do anything for. In comparison, we have Xilonen. Her resistance shred lasts for 15 seconds, and the damage buff from the scroll set also lasts 15 seconds. Kind of. The scroll set has 2 parts to it, a 12% damage buff that is 15 seconds long, and a 28% damage buff that is 20 seconds long. Regardless, this doesn't really matter much, as her buffs are long enough that you only need to cast them once in a rotation for them to have really solid uptime, unless it's a very long field time character. But even then, you should just be able to use her closer to the carry's field time to where it doesn't become an issue. Her resistance shred is also guaranteed, so even on a double Pyro melt team, she will still run into the same issues Kazuha has where he can't react with both elements. But her buff is long enough to where you can apply cryo at the start, set up her skill and burst, go through the rest of your rotation, and your cryo carry will still be buffed for a majority of your rotation, while your Pyro unit will still benefit from the resistance shred. And then for Pyro Vape teams, again, you can Pyro crystallize at the start of your rotation for the scroll set, using your Hydro unit, then using Xilonen's EN normals for the Hydro crystallize, and from there finish your rotation. Or I guess you could just skip this and get away with your Hydra unit only getting buffed by the resistance shred. There are also teams like Double Hydra Hu Tao, in which Kazuha or any 4th slot in the team weren't really able to buff Hu Tao, but with Xilonen that isn't necessarily the case anymore. Her shred will also carry on in multi-wave without the need for it to be reapplied, making damage between waves more consistent, as well as shredding resistances on enemies with innate auras, which Kazuha can't do anything for. So for the fact that Xilonen and Kazuha's buffs are relative while Xilonen's last longer, carries on in multi-wave and can be more adaptable depending on the rotation, I think she's just just consistently a stronger buffer than Kazuha is. The scroll set may sometimes be inconsistent, but the rest shot is guaranteed while needing no setups, and there's a lot of value in that. The first point goes to Xilonen. Now for their accessibility, basically how easy they are to play on top of their gearing options, this should be more straightforward. Kazuha has two big quality of life upsides, being his grouping and his burst helping to enable reactions on teams like Electrocharge or Aggravate, or being consistent AoE Hydra application in some vape teams. Xilonen's quality of life upsides is the fact that she heals, allowing her to be a solo sustain unit on teams, giving you a further layer of comfortability, as well as enabling slightly more Fury in a fan for stacks. And as I said in the previous section, just being able to buff for such a long time that also carries on in multi-wave situations. This point really does depend, as especially in boss scenarios, grouping can be useless or just against enemies like rune lords that can't be grouped. But for me, having grouping is such a massive quality of life improvement on top of the AoE damage it gives in some teams, that's really hard to say that Xilonen outweighs this. There are some teams like again Aggravate where you really feel how much having consistent scrolls on the teams makes it drastically feel better. There are situations like this current 12-2-1 where unless you're Nuvula or Chlorine to have really good AoEs, or Mualani who has a guaranteed AoE ability, you can just end up pushing enemies away before you have a chance to finish them, resulting in you having to chase enemies and kill them one by one, which affects clear times a lot. Now in regards to their gearing options, without factoring 5-star weapons, they both are very easy to build. Xilonen's buffs aren't tied to a stat, only her healing and damages, so you can really slap whatever you want on her, especially if you don't care about her healing. The only thing is her resistance shred is based on talent, so you ideally want to crown her skill. For Kazuha on the other hand, you don't have to care about his talents at all, though his buffing is tied to his stat being elemental mastery, and you also want the VV set of course. EM pieces are statistically the hardest to farm for in terms of main stats, but you'll only need 2 on set, so it shouldn't be that bad. I'm still looking for a second EM circlet for my Sucrose that isn't a 4-star, but who cares? The main problem comes from trying to balance energy, as he needs like 160 to 200 energy recharge, but Favonius or Xiphos can solve this. Basically just Favonius, because no one pulled for Xiphos. Kazuha is slightly harder to gear, but realistically it's not that bad. In conclusion, this may just be a personal thing, but I feel like just having grouping is such a massive positive that it's hard to not give Kazuha the point here. It makes so many characters and teams much easier to pilot and makes clear times and AoE chambers more consistent, so he's getting the point. The next category I want to talk about is flexibility, so basically just team options in which besides being an off-field damage dealer for Wanderer mono Onoma teams or double Onoma teams that focus on scroll damage, Xilonen should pretty comfortably slot into all of Kazuha's teams where buffing is a priority, and more because she's also very impactful into Navi and Noelle teams. Also, she's a healer. I know people have qualms with her being a single target healer and not team-wide, but this myth that Fiorina needs a team-wide healer needs to die. As long as that single target healer provides benefit on top of getting some fanfare, it will be worthwhile. Look at Bennett Fiorina teams or Kuki Dendro teams, they still get very good utilization out of Fiorina, even though they're single target healers. There are also some teams you can use them together in, like mono teams, so for Linny, Arlecchino as well as Nuvolette. Though in Nuvolette's case, at least if he's C0, I'm not sure if I'd recommend her over Zhongli, as you just lose the shield and it may not feel as good to play. Anyways, TLDR, as a buffer, Xilonen can basically play in all of Kazuha's teams, while also being able to be your sole defensive option, on top of having some play in Geo teams. She just has more flexibility and therefore gets the point. The last thing I can really come up for support is vertical investment, in which I'm only going to talk about the early upgrades, so the signature weapon as well as the first 2 constellations. Starting with the weapons, Kazuha's gives a 16% basic attack buff and 20% attack, where Xilonen with her weapon nerfs back down gives a 25.6% elemental damage buff. Even just looking at things practically, first, Kazuha may have to run lower EM to build more ER to use this weapon, as you don't get the energy benefits that Xiphos or Favonius provide. On top of this, it gives attack percent and a basic attack damage bonus buff, which isn't something that every elemental damage dealer can benefit from. But when it does work, so for characters like Hu Tao, Ganyu, Arlecchino, Linny, basically any basic attacker that scales off of attack, it does do great. But it is kind of niche compared to Xilonen's weapon, which is just a universal damage buff that improves all of her teams by around 7 to 10%, while not requiring anything else from the player. In terms of Constellation ones, both of those aren't really anything game breaking. For combat applications, Xilonen provides a really weak interruption resistance increase that you'll only feel when you play Natlan characters, or any character that already gets base interruption resistance, where Kazuha's resets your skill cooldown when you cast his burst, allowing you to chain skills much easier. The benefit to this is that you can technically generate more energy and it feels really nice in multi-wave content as someone who owns this constellation, but most teams have quite strict rotations due to buff uptime and durations, so using Kazuha's skill twice over just putting on a Favonius really isn't worth it. You should really only see these constellations as gateways to their second ones. And hot take, but Kazuha C2 really isn't that great, and it's not just because I'm salty that I pulled for it. It gives Kazuha himself 200 more EM, which contributes to his damage bonus, and it also gives the active character 200 EM. The problem really isn't the buffing at all. It's the fact that it lasts 8 seconds, and because it gives elemental mastery, it's only really impactful in reaction teams where you have to do double swirl setups. But using vape teams as an example, the only double swirl setups where you use Kazuha's burst is at the start of the rotation, and therefore it will just fall off halfway through your carry's field time. I've even been looking through vape carry speedruns, and as I guessed, a lot of them just skip using his burst. That is how little of a difference it makes. It still of course is good for jangling on international teams, and it also works well for aggravate teams as Fischl can snapshot the buff, and the on-field carry will benefit from it too. But besides that, I really don't see a massive gain from it, especially compared to Xilonen C2, which again doesn't need you to make any gameplay changes while giving you stronger and more universal buffs to the character to the respective element. I've made a video already going over how potent these buffs are, so I won't repeat that as you can just go watch the video, but it is overall a better Constellation than Kazuha's, and for that she takes this point very easily. In conclusion, Xilonen is kinda just a better support than Kazuha. However, Kazuha still has his one saving grace in grouping, which is why even though on paper Xilonen just takes these categories, in any practical AoE situation where grouping can give you a benefit, Kazuha will be better there. Also, this should not be a reason to avoid pulling Kazuha. These characters are very relative in terms of their supportive capabilities, and having 2 of them would be very ideal. Overall, for any team where Kazuha's swirls are important like aggravate or electrocharge teams, I think he'll still dominate those. Everywhere else, Xilonen is just as good if not better. And with that, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts on this topic, as I'd love to hear and respond to almost every single comment. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys on the flip side. Peace.